it was...
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Undiscovered Beasts and Strange Phenomena. Please join our experienced and knowledgeable panel of hosts as we explore the great mysteries of our time: Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, and unexplained phenomena.
Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to our show. Joining Mike tonight, it's a welcome appearance again for David Weatherly. He's done many different things and he's a prolific author. We're going to cover a wide range of topics tonight. His latest book, Copper State Monsters, is due for release in just a few weeks, and then it follows on from Silver State Monsters, which was about Nevada, a successful book about the cryptids of Nevada. And now he's focusing in on Arizona. Good evening, David, and welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, I love having you on. So we've got many things I want to talk to you about. I have a whole bunch of questions written down, but let's start with this new book first of all. When's it coming out, and what's it about?
So Copper State Monsters covers the cryptids and legends of Arizona, and it should be released probably by mid-April. It's just in the final stages right now, and should be up on Amazon certainly by the end of the month, but hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And it covers a whole range of the different creatures in the state. You know, what I've kind of tried to do with this new series, which started with Silver State Monsters based on the Legends of Nevada, is to kind of go old-style cryptozoology book. I wanted to cover some of the fantastic creatures and blend that in with the Native American tales, the folklore of the region, and also, you know, practical things like invasive species. And it's pretty fascinating. You know, you go state to state, you'll find such a wide range of differences. So with Arizona, one of the interesting things is, of course, there are a lot of out-of-place animals that turn up in Arizona. And that ranges everything from, you know, the modern waves of killer bees that are swarming around the portion of the state to other legends like the little-known Arizona camel corps that resulted in camels being set loose and running wild in Arizona. And, of course, you know, I cover things like the Mogollon Monster and the infamous Thunderbird photograph, as well as Thunderbird sightings in the state.
Good. I mean, Thunderbirds was the first topic I really wanted to talk to you about. So, in your view, what are Thunderbirds? Could you set the scene and then explain what you think they might be?
Well, sure. So, this is one of those kind of interesting things in cryptozoology that crosses several lines. What we get is one version of Thunderbirds. Of course, classically, the term Thunderbird comes from Native American mythos, and it was regarded as this massive bird that was sort of a spiritual being, but at the same time sometimes viewed as being a physical creature also. It was said to be so massive that when it flapped its wings, it caused thunder and lightning, and, you know, it controlled the storms, and it had all these different things associated with the spirit of the Thunderbird. And has that legend sort of moved through time, we get modern interpretations that really kind of vary. So one version is that a Thunderbird is actually just a giant physical bird, sometimes described as almost like an eagle or, you know, some other feathered large creature that we would recognize as a bird. However, there's also another creature that people commonly dub a Thunderbird, and that is said to be essentially a surviving dinosaur. So you look at these things and, you know, they look like something out of a classic dinosaur film with leathery wings and, you know, of course, the large, oddly shaped head and so forth. So it's really, it's one of the most intriguing creatures, I think, in cryptozoology because it crosses all those lines. And, we go back in history and we have these historical sightings, but then we also have, fairly modern accounts, too, people spotting these giant birds that they dub Thunderbirds.
Yeah, and I've been interested in. I was interested in that. That's why I wanted to turn to that first. I mean, when I was thinking about the show, I was looking at the pelicans that are around here, and obviously you see some herons on the river just by here. And a heron, when it's in flight, almost looks like a pterodactyl in a way. The shape of it and everything else. But do you think that people are mistaken and seeing that, or are they seeing something prehistoric? And I'm not trying to dismiss people's sightings. I mean, Mike, who produces this show, has a very good account of a Thunderbird sighting. But are people mistaken, or is it something else, David?
I think it's some of both, Adam, to tell you the truth, because I think that if we approach it in a practical manner and say, all right, there are occasions when people are seeing a bird that is just not that common. The American condor, for instance, it doesn't have a very large, very wide range or anything, and they're very, very limited number of that species left. However, if someone were to see one, it's not a common sight. They're probably going to be fairly shocked, and say, oh my gosh, what is that massive bird? There are other creatures that fit that bill too, that just are not common sights in a lot of regions. And if people see one, I think that they may have a difficult time judging the actual size. It's very difficult to gauge the size of something in flight. And without any kind of perspective, sometimes I'm sure you've seen these photographs too that people send you. I know I get them, and they say, "Oh, this bird had a 20-foot wingspan," and it's a bird at a distance in the air, and there's nothing for size comparison or anything else. Anomalous sightings, right, where people have a closer encounter with something, and they say that no, this thing, the wings were leather, and they describe the head in detail, and it's pretty fascinating. It really is. And, we kind of go down the rabbit hole, I think, when we start looking for explanations to try to understand exactly, what explains that sighting.
Well, one of the things that, I want to put to you, and then I want to go and explore what you think they might be. But as a tracker, and I like looking at birds. I look at many different bird species as well, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert on birds. But I do note them. If I saw a creature like that, and I'd seen it say more than once, I'd be inclined to follow it as much as I possibly could to see where it might nest, to learn more about it. And one of the weaknesses, I may say, from a skeptical point of view of the Thunderbird is that we've never obviously found any nesting areas or any potential eggs or anything like that. And it seems more likely that it's misidentification. Would you say that that's not the case? Would you say that, these are real creatures or not?
I tend, for the most part, I tend to agree with you on that, because I think that, the bulk of these sightings, they probably are mistaken identity just because of the context and so forth. And, as I said a few moments ago, mistaken identity and people that just aren't used to seeing or judging the size of these creatures and so forth, those things can account for a lot of the sightings. But again, there are those anomalous handfuls of sightings that are just the ones that really leave you scratching your head and trying to understand exactly what happened here. And too far away from the, without going too far down the rabbit hole, you have to consider, well, what are people seeing? Are they seeing something that was, did they see briefly into the past, or, did they have some kind of a vision themselves that was so real that they, that it felt physical? Or I think there are just so many potential possibilities to explain some of those other weirder sightings that, we just have to continue to pursue it and try to determine exactly what's going on. And it's hard, too, because we're talking about a creature really that, unlike Sasquatch, no one has reported finding any prints, no tracks. There's nothing. So there's nothing physical or tangible to really hook these things onto at this point, anyway.
Yeah, and that was what I was interested in. Okay, there's one thing I want to focus in on that you said there. So let's make some assumptions. So let's say that it's not always a case of mistaken identity. And you mentioned the notion there of time slips. I'm interested in that. Please, can you expand on what the speculation might be in relation to that?
Sure. Well, there's a few different versions of how this potential phenomena is occurring. Sometimes it's that people reportedly, step back in time briefly, or they have an experience where different periods of time overlap with each other. And you read about these time slips, which is gaining a lot of attention in the last couple of years, actually. This idea that sometimes there are just these crossing points, right, that occur. And you'll read accounts about people going into a building and walking through a door, and they're in a different time period. The room is set in a different fashion. The people in the room are in different clothing, from the 1800s, for instance, or something. And then when they walk back out, everything is modern. And a few moments later, when they, inevitably ask, well, is that a reenactment? What's going on in that room? And they go through the door again, and everything is normal. It's all modern. So, the phenomena is this idea that these different time periods can occasionally intersect. And that really fascinates me because it sort of goes back to some traditional tribal lore that talks about portals or doorways that can open at times that sort of are windows to the past or windows to other times. And, I think that's a pretty intriguing phenomena. As humanity, we really don't understand a whole lot about the nature of time. Even with recent advances in quantum sciences and everything, it's something that we're really just starting to grapple with some and trying to fathom and understand. And, I always revert back to Einstein's idea that time was like an ocean and you could potentially drop in at any point. And that's an interesting visual to me because it's all not necessarily moving in a very linear chronological fashion as we're taught to believe.
Yeah, and I'm interested in that. One of the things that I read recently, I don't know whether you're familiar with it, is that scientists have postulated that you can travel into the future, and indeed you can measure that. So an astronaut who travels near the speed of light would come back and he'd be a lot younger than us, depending on how long you've been up there.
Right.
And you're familiar with the relativity concept.
That's right.
This obviously isn't a science show. I'm not going to teach relativity here. But that's a basic principle. Now, what they found recently is that, very recently, that it may well be possible to travel into the past. I mean, that's one of the scientific speculation pieces out there. Right. One of the things that I've always been fascinated about was the idea that there are parallel universes too. And when I was a kid, and when the notion of parallel universes, if you'd done your physics paper on parallel universes, you would have got kicked out. But now it's completely the other way, and to suggest that there isn't is almost a heresy. So I think scientists are more open to the notion of fluidity of time and parallel universes than they ever were, which I find very encouraging. Good. So when we talk about Thunderbirds, and you mentioned some of the other points there, and one that I wrote down because I was curious about was killer bees. Do you want to expand a little on that, please, David?
Oh, sure. So, this was pretty intriguing to me, for me to write about, actually, because I grew up of course, in the United States, and in the 1970s, when I was a teenager, was really when I started delving into, all kinds of strange phenomena and everything else. But in practical terms, one of the things that had a whole surgence of interest in the media was the idea of killer bees. And, you can just imagine this, Adam, as a kid, you're hearing all these stories, and the media was really leading people to believe that at any time this massive swarm that blackened the sky was going to invade the U.S. and we were all going to die by, thousands of these things. So, of course, the 70s came and went, and it didn't happen, and they made all kinds of disaster movies and everything else about, massive swarms of killer bees, and it was an infamous one called The Swarm.
Michael, I think Michael Caine was in that. I think I remember reading an interview as to where he said it was his worst ever film.
Right, yeah. Yeah, which was kind of funny because, the film was made by, this is just a little bit of trivia, the film was made by a guy named Irwin Allen, who during that time period had made a lot of disaster movies that had done really, really well in the box office. But this particular movie was just a complete flop. It really bombed. And it had a stellar cast and everything, but it just didn't do anything. So, anyway, back to the bees, what we're looking at is in the late 1950s, they introduced Africanized bees to colonies in Brazil. And what they were trying to do was increase honey production. So, what happens whenever humans start tinkering around with nature, something gets screwed up. And inevitably, what happened was during this whole crossbreeding process, a beekeeper who was visiting took some of the screens off and let a whole swarm of these bees loose. And I think I want to say it was like 26 swarms out of these different hives escaped. And that was sort of the beginning of it all because, these bees are extremely aggressive. They will, they essentially take colonies over. They started crossbreeding and taking over, for the American honeybee. And despite the media, professing to us that the entire country was going to be swarmed in the early 70s, it didn't really happen. It took much longer for them to really take much of a foothold in the United States, but eventually they did. And one of the areas they have really taken hold is Arizona, southern Arizona. Part of that is because of the climate. Part of it, I think, is just directional, because they came up through out of Brazil and into Mexico and on into Arizona. So, it's become a very serious problem at this point in the southern part of the state. And, there are deaths on record from people encountering these bees. The swarms can grow, the hives, can grow to massive size. There was a case in, I believe it was Tucson, where an elderly gentleman, called pest control out essentially, and they found the hive in the attic of his house, and they had to remove a whole large section of the roof of his house to get to this hive because it was so massive inside. So we're talking about, hives. They're saying that some of these hives can reach up to, like 1 million bees. So you can just imagine, there was a case in 2014, I think it was, where they estimated a swarm of 800,000 bees attacked a man.
Oh.
And this is something that in a lot of ways we're really, people really aren't prepared for. These are very aggressive creatures. They will chase people for up to a mile at least from the site of the initial attack. There are a whole range of things that set them off. Of course, any kind of motorized equipment. So gardeners and construction people and people like that are particularly vulnerable to these bees. And once one, dives in and starts attacking you, all the others follow suit, and they just don't let up. Terrible stuff.
Now, of the creatures that we haven't talked about, I mean, in your new book, which do you think were the most plausible and which the least plausible, and why?
Oh, wow. Let's see. The least well, actually, the Arizona book covers a few legends that are pretty intriguing, but at the same time, you're just kind of like, well, okay. One of the ones that's probably the weirdest is in southern Arizona around the Superstition Mountains. There are legends of lizard creatures. So, you think kind of like the Bishopville lizard man.
Yeah.
And, you hear these stories, and I've heard a few of the accounts myself, that people have told me about. And there's one very, very well-known story that has been told so many different times about these a gentleman who were biking around the Superstition Mountains, and they encountered this lizard man. And, it's this whole detailed story, and I like to really try to get to the root of things. So when I was exploring this whole topic of these lizard people, I wanted to find the source of the story, and I eventually did trace back what appeared to be the original source of the story, which is a website that is, let's say, not exactly factual. So, they post all these, quote, cryptozoological stories, but most of them are complete fabrication. And that seems to be the case with this particular tale. Unfortunately, like a lot of things with the Internet, this is a story that was immediately picked up by other scripted websites and, reposted and reproduced, and people talk about it. And it wasn't 6 months ago, I encountered someone at a conference, and they were recounting this story, and I said, "Wait a minute, what? Do you know what the source of the story is? Have you ever heard of it? You ever interviewed? Did you interview the man who had?" Because I was really intrigued, and I said, here's the source of the story. It's a fabrication, sadly. Now, all of that being said, I will tell you, strangely enough, there are legends of a race of lizard people in the Superstition Mountains that dates all the way back to the Native Americans. Now, the Native Americans consider the Superstitions a very sort of a taboo area. It's a very strange place. There are disappearances that occur in there. The Superstitions are the location of the famous Lost Dutchman's gold mine. So lots of fascinating legends in that region. And there are native tales that say that the superstitions are the domain of the lizard people, is what it translates to, and that if you tread upon their territory, they will take you.
So
and
what do they look like?
They purportedly look like bipedal reptilian creatures. So we're talking two-legged humanoid lizards that are stalking around in the deserts of southern Arizona. And it's a creepy story, it's kind of something that is, of course, unnerving to a lot of people. And, we have to, it's something I would like to delve into more just because of the folklore associated with the region and, of course, the native lore. But a lot of the Native Americans are reluctant to talk too much about it because, again, the area is more or less taboo.
So is there any way that these could be connected, or are they two different phenomena, with these stories of prehistoric survivors that you sometimes hear about in Arizona and Texas? Not just Thunderbirds, but small dinosaur-like creatures. Are they connected in any way, or are they two different things?
Well, I think that's two different things, although, the two do sometimes sort of dovetail. I know there are scattered reports of these, people seeing dinosaurs, quote, in the American Southwest. And that specifically I didn't cover in the Arizona book simply because I just couldn't find any witnesses I could talk to about those cases, and I couldn't find any really solid, reliable accounts that I could cover on that. I know my old colleague who we lost a couple of years ago, J.C. Johnson, he used to talk some about these sightings of things that people would describe as, velociraptors or, miniature T-Rexes and all these strange things. But, in Arizona specifically, I just couldn't find much in the way of that to really pursue.
Okay, good. So you have this filtration process, and you look at those. I just want to sort of widen it out a little bit, and we'll come back to the book later on. One of the things that I was really intrigued about that you've done a lot of research on are black-eyed children, and I want to tie them in with a couple of other things. Could you explain a little bit? I mean, I know you've written a lot about this, and I've got more interested in it recently as I've spoken to more people who've said they've had encounters with men in black. Are men in black and black-eyed children the same thing, or are they different?
They're different, but there do appear to be some connections on occasion between the two phenomena. So the black-eyed children phenomena, really, it's, by a lot of people's accounts, it began to manifest, let us say, in 1997 with the account of Brian Bethel, a journalist out of Texas, who had an encounter with these two children. And he posted his account online and started to, he posted in an early chat room, and he asked for people, to give their opinions and so forth. And it was such a creepy little story, even though it wasn't, very detailed or very long. But Bethel's account essentially was that he went out one evening to drop a check in a late night payment box, and he was sitting in a strip center, sitting in his car at the center, and writing the check out. And these two kids approached his vehicle, and when they did, he was initially nervous, and he didn't know why. He wasn't in a bad section of town or anything else, but what he did was he just rolled the window down a little bit, and to see what they wanted, and they began to speak to him, and they were making these weird requests. They said, "Hey, we want to see this movie and forgot our money. We need you to take us home to our mother." And they were saying it in these very odd inflections, and he'd never seen these two kids in his life, of course. So his initial nervousness started to grow, and he did have the presence of mind to kind of glance over at the movie marquee and realize that the last showing of this film was already well underway. So it didn't make any sense that these kids were going to try to get someone to take them home, get money, and come back for, the last third of the movie or something. So as he is showing reluctance, they get a bit more pushy, and they say, "Just let us in the car, mister. We're just a couple of kids." And at that point, his nervousness had kind of developed into fear. And he looked at these kids and realized that there were some odd things about them physically. So they had very pale skin, but when he made eye contact with the child that was closest to his vehicle, he realized this boy had solid black eyes. And his flight response kicked in. He threw the car into gear. He backed out. And as he was driving away, he looked in his rearview mirror and realized that these children had completely vanished. So, that really, that just, you can imagine the psychological impact on this guy from having this experience. He, as I said, he went and posted this account online, hoping to get some answers. And there's some interesting things about what happened to Brian in the aftermath of this, because he posted his account. He was so overwhelmed with the number of people responding and posting. And, of course, other people chimed in and said, "Oh, my God, I've seen the same thing in Portland. I've seen this in Cleveland." All these other accounts started cropping up. And Bethel actually, he retreated from the whole thing at one point. He went offline. He stopped asking questions. I initially wrote the book and released the first edition of it in 2012. And when I had released the book, Brian wasn't even reachable. He wouldn't speak to anyone about the phenomenon. And, I made several attempts, and all I could do essentially was just cover his story as best as I could. And in the aftermath of it, it was interesting because he reached out to me, and he said, I've read your book. I really appreciate it. And we kind of started a dialogue. When I revised the book in 2017 for the 5 years later, it was also 20 years since he had his encounter. So the revised edition of the book has a whole additional chapter that essentially is Brian Bethel 20 years later, reflecting on his encounter and how much it had continued to affect his life, long after the event. And it's really hard, when you tell the story, and you tell a lot of these accounts from the outside, don't quite understand. They say, "Oh, so what? You saw a couple of creepy-looking kids." But there's other aspects to these encounters, and one of them is the amount of fear that these people experience. And, Adam, I've interviewed a lot of people who have had encounters with these things, and these victims, the people who witness these things, they come across as trauma victims because they've encountered something that is so unsettling at a core level that they just can't, they have such a hard time moving beyond it that it haunts them.
Now, and I do find it fascinating. That's why I wanted to pick up on it, because you are an expert on this particular phenomenon. So when we look at them, it might seem an obtuse question. It's not, though. I'm trying to get consistency of visuals. So obviously the children are black-eyed. What other than that, do they look completely different? Do they look the same, these children? And how does their voice sound? Let's delve a little deeper into their physical descriptions, if we can.
So sure. Typically, what is described is most often the children are described as being in their early teens down to about 10 years of age. So anywhere from 10 to 13 or 14, those are probably the most common ages that people peg them at. Although you do hear variations, you hear, he was probably 8, or some people say, I look like a 16-year-old kid and so forth. But some of the other things are very consistent. For instance, of course, the eyes are the most stunning aspect of these, visually. They have solid black eyes, and it kind of evokes the image of the classic gray alien, that haunted so many people on the cover of Communion and things like that. So, no whites, no color, no nothing. It's just a solid black orb. And the skin is usually described as very pale or pasty, which, of course, just, I think, probably makes the eyes pop even a little bit more, in appearance. And then there are other curious things, because I always, when I interview people who've had these experiences, I like to, get as many details as I can, obviously, and ask a lot of things that often people don't think about when they tell the account. So, one of the common things I ask is, did you notice any blemish on this child? Did you see a freckle, a pimple, anything, a scar, anything? Never has anyone seen anything like that on one of these children. Now, we're talking about, on average, kids that are in puberty. So why no blemishes? Why no freckles, for crying out loud? Nothing else, nothing. And one of the other things I always ask is, did either of these children, or how many ever there were, I said, did you see a cell phone or an iPad? Were they wearing a watch, anything like that? Never. There's never any mention of any electronic device whatsoever. Now, come on. I've raised teenagers. How often do you see one without a, without an iPod, an headset, or a cell phone that they're texting on?
My daughter's 14, and she's rarely without her iPad. I know what you mean.
Exactly.
So there's a couple of questions I have. Do they have different hair color? Did you ever get that description, or is it the same? And what about their voices? Do they sound different?
Yeah, I always ask about those things. So the hair color varies. Most of the time, the typical response to colors of things associated with these kids, whether it be their hair color or their clothing or anything else, the people always say, well, it was just kind of drab. It was just plain brown, dark brown, dirty blonde. You hear, those are the common things that you hear. I've never heard, for instance, I've never had anyone report a redheaded black-eyed child. I've never had anyone report, one with like really, really light blonde hair or anything like that. The same thing with the clothing. People, when you ask them what these children were wearing, it's almost always these very kind of nondescript colors, like, dark blue or gray, brown, things like that. And the language is a whole nother topic, because that is just as bizarre as the rest of the encounter. People usually say that these children speak in a very monotone manner. They speak in a very weird fashion. So This is where it sort of coincides with a lot of Men in Black encounters, in that in many of these cases, the black-eyed children don't seem to really understand what some modern things are. So, there's the famous story of the Men in Black encountering a Jell-O cup, right, and not knowing, what it was. There's one with these black-eyed children, being confronted by a woman who essentially asked them, with several expletives in her sentence, why they didn't use the doorbell, and she pointed at the doorbell. And they just looked at her, and they looked back at the doorbell and at her. And she said in that moment, she realized that this kid had no idea what a doorbell was, even though she was pointing it out. Because in the accounts, they always knocked. They never use a doorbell. And, they ask these bizarre questions. They make statements that while they're English, they're not common phrases. They're not certainly not the way a teenager would speak, and really not the way people in general would speak. So, there's a case of them, one of these kids asking if it's food time. No one speaks like that. So, it's time for dinner, or is it time to eat?
David, they speak with an American accent. They've not got any other foreign accent. They're American.
Well, for the most part, they seem to speak very frequently in the native language of the people they're confronting. So, I have some accounts from Hispanic people who say, well, the kids were speaking Spanish. I have accounts, from, of course, many American accounts. And they all say, well, they were speaking English. And usually the person will say, no, I didn't hear any accent. There's one that you'll love, Adam, from a guy in London who was a government employee who encountered these kids. And he said that he felt like they were doing a very poor imitation of a British accent. So, they knocked on his door and asked to watch the telly, for instance. And he said that, in further conversations with him, he talked about how at first maybe they were trying to make fun of him or something. And he was a gentleman who had been educated in the United States, but worked for his government in Britain. And, he'd heard a lot of different accents. And he said he just couldn't understand exactly what these kids were, trying to convey, or what they were doing in this conversation. It was bizarre.
So it's interesting. So have any of them threatened people, or do they just try and gain access to the house? What's their motivation, do you think, David? What do they want?
Oh, it's always a push to be invited across the threshold, which of course becomes fascinating when we look at that in correlation with, classic demonology, with the folklore of vampires and other negative creatures. These kids, they never charge across the threshold. They never force their way in. They always try to elicit this invitation. And, sometimes they want an invitation into the home. Sometimes they want an invitation into the person's vehicle, place of business, whatever it is. And, really, I think we're going to go esoteric for a moment again here and go back to this idea that they seem to want to generate fear. And I say that because in these cases, inevitably, once the person's flight instinct kicks in and they've reached that peak of fear, these children vanish. And,
they just vanish.
To me, this goes full circle. This to me goes full circle because my personal theory on these things is that they are interdimensional beings. And
I was going to.
I believe. I believe they actually feed on.
So they're like fear creatures.
They're parasites. They're feeding on that energy.
Is there any examples of them actually? When people say they vanish, I mean, what happens if they ever come inside the house? Do they do anything, or do they still just disappear?
Well, there's not. If you look online, there's so many accounts of people claiming that they let these kids inside, and unfortunately, it's hard to really vet those accounts. There's some of them are really out there. They're talking about people, people are claiming, I let the kids in, now I have cancer and all these different kind of things.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily discounting them. I'm saying that, those are people that the ones I did try to pursue and talk to, you aren't able to get a hold of the actual, quote, victim. So I don't know how much validity there is to some of those accounts. I know that I did have an account that is in the book about a woman whose child, her son let one of these kids in their vehicle, and the black-eyed child was in very close proximity to this boy. And in the aftermath, the little boy became very ill for a time. So, there are other cases of people I've spoken to who have had some physical contact kids. There was a woman who reached out and touched one of these kids and said that the child was, icy cold, like something dead. And, this woman experienced a lot of misfortunes. So there is this implication that physical contact or being in close proximity to these kids would lead to some very serious physical problems at the least.
So when we talk about them, and we just touched on it then, you think they're interdimensional creatures of a kind. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Is there any other insights that you've gleaned through studying these reports?
No, well, this kind of circles right back around to what we were talking about early in the show, and that's this idea of other dimensions of existence. And because of my background, I spent a good portion of my life pursuing shamanic studies with different elders around the country and around the world, actually. And, that's always been hand in hand for me with the pursuit of the unknown. And one of the things that I've heard since I was a kid from these elders is this idea of there being other dimensions of existence. And, the elders will tell you, well, we know that those, these creatures, they used to be here and they left, and they'll say, well, they left through a shimmering doorway, or they left through a hole in the mountain, or, you hear all these different versions. Now, what really fascinates me about that is that, of course, we go back to quantum sciences again, and this idea that quantum physicists have now that is accepted that, oh, by the way, we know there are other dimensions of existence. We don't know how to get there or what's there, but we know they're there. Well, I have to add, okay, well, just because we don't know what's there and we can't get there doesn't mean that something there can't get here. Because, again, you go back to this ancient lore that you can find all over the world, and there's this idea that there were other races of beings that used to be here and they left. Well, who's to say they don't know how to come back whenever they want to?
So when we look at that, I want to now sort of look at the compare and contrast exercise that we were starting on with these men in black. And obviously the men in black, and most people will be familiar with them more, they're often found around or after alleged alien encounters, or someone says they've reported a UFO. Is that a correct assumption, David, or would you add anything to
that? You mean just the correlation with the men in black and the black-eyed children, or in general?
No, I mean, just men in black separately, and then we'll do the correlation of the two together. So men in black are normally seen around aliens, aren't they?
Well, very often around UFO sightings, which it makes it a very intriguing topic because you get a phenomena that has a range of manifestations. Because some people who encounter these men in black say no, they're human. They just they act as strange. Some people think they're some kind of government agents, but then you get other versions too. Some people think that they're almost robotic in their nature, and some people say, well, there are accounts that imply these men in black are actually aliens or some type of alien hybrid. And, it becomes very strange. These encounters, these MIBs, they will sometimes pose as government agents, and at the very least they will imply that they have some kind of authority. And they will come and, of course, instruct people, sort of lay down the law and say, you are not to discuss your UFO sighting. You didn't see anything. You need to forget what you experienced. And it's a very bizarre phenomenon. Of course, my good colleague Nick Redfern has written extensively on it. And the Men in Black, they really have quite a history that goes back pretty far. If you sort of take it outside of the box of UFOs, you can go back even further historically. We can do the same thing with black-eyed children, actually. But we can take that outside of the UFO box and go back in time. And you look at accounts, a lot of the accounts of witchcraft, of witches, would talk about a man in black that showed up and manifested to these witches. And
really, so
you have to
medieval times.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, back in those times, what we're looking at is the implication that it's a manifestation of the devil. Satan himself appearing as a man in black. In fact, you go back even to the American South. There's folklore about Satan, showing up as a man in a black suit and the man in black and he's dressed nice and so forth. And it's sort of the same theme in a sense, that recurs. Just like with the black-eyed children, you take the modern parameters off. That's one of the things I did when I wrote the book was I wanted to know how old this phenomenon was. I wanted to take the modern applications away and sort of look at it through a different lens. And what I found that you have to do, or what I found that I had to do, was to take away that acronym, because black-eyed child, BEK, which is a common acronym, stands for black-eyed kids, is what everybody identifies these accounts as now. But that acronym came from the Brian Bethel account in 1997. If you take that away and you take that around as the sole identifier, and you look for accounts that are in that same range, that's when it gets really interesting. And what you have to do is look at it through a different lens, a different cultural lens or the view of a different time period. So, for instance, I found an account from the 1950s, and it is hands down a black-eyed child encounter, but nowhere in the account is it called a BEK or black-eyed child. They didn't have that term back then. They called this thing a demon. It was in the form of a child with pale skin and solid black eyes, and it tried to gain an invitation into this young man's house. So, you strip those identifiers away, but you keep the parameters of the encounter, and then it becomes much more interesting because we start to realize that this is a phenomenon that's been here a very, very long time. And people through, their own view of the time period or the religious belief or culture are going to identify it in the best way they can. But you can certainly find those correlations and sort of step back through the history of many of these phenomena.
Very, very fascinating stuff. So when we look at the Men in Black and we look at the black-eyed children, are they the same thing or something different?
I think there's something different, yeah. But, I can't help but wonder sometimes what the core consciousness is behind a lot of this phenomena. I know that, one of the people that influenced me a lot was John Keel. And Keel used to talk about some of the things we're talking about tonight, actually, these portal or window areas that were openings to other places, maybe other dimensions, potentially other times. And then this whole idea that there was a much larger consciousness behind much of this phenomena that was directing how much of it manifested. And, of course, if you look at some of the things that he chronicled, his detailed approach to the Mothman encounters and the UFO sightings and everything around Point Pleasant and all the weirdness that he experienced when that was going on, and some of the other cases too. But also, the fact that he sort of started developing this idea that there was just sort of a larger mind directing the whole thing, if that makes sense.
Well, we'll come on to that. I was just intrigued. So the Men in Black, what do you think they are? And then I want to talk about this consciousness, if I may. What do you think of Men in Black?
I think that, I think like a lot of phenomena, I don't think there's any one specific answer to identify what a phenomenon is, because it seems to change and morph so much. Now, whether there's something behind it all directing it, that may be the case, and it may just be causing things to manifest in different ways. But I think, you look at the Men in Black, I certainly believe that there are some cases where they are indeed someone working for some faction of the government that is, either quieting a witness down, perhaps because they saw a military test or something. And I think there are other occasions where these Men in Black are simply something that we just can't quite explain what they are. Maybe they are something interdimensional or something otherworldly to some degree.
So when we talk about this higher consciousness, the manifesting, what do we mean by that?
Let me give you an example of something that happened to me.
Okay.
In conjunction with what we're talking about. So when the Black-Eyed Children, when the book first came out, I wrote the book with an approach that I wanted to give the correlations between the Black-Eyed Children and different types of phenomena and say, okay, it could be alien hybrids, here's why. It could be something demonic, here's why. Because I wanted people to pursue the topic on their own, make up their own mind, do their own research. And, I think I was successful at that. I've had people walk away reading the book and saying, okay, I'm convinced they're, demonic entities or whatever. That's okay. And I've had other people who just used it as a departure point to look at all the various aspects of the phenomena. One of the weird things that started happening after the book was released was I started having people contacting me saying that they were experiencing strange electronic phenomena when they started reading the book. Now, at first it was just one or two people, and then it kind of grew. I had probably a few handfuls of people who were reporting this to me. Now, that's kind of interesting because, again, here's a correlation. Men in Black, a lot of times there are strange things that happen to electronics around Men in Black sightings. The same thing is known to happen with some Black-Eyed Kid encounters. Security cameras will malfunction, cell phones will stop working, things like that. So I thought this is pretty fascinating. I wonder where this is going to go, so on and so forth. And then what happened was I received a call one day on my cell phone. I sat in my office, and it was a friend of mine who is back in Kentucky. And I picked up the phone, and it's dead air. There's some background noise or something. I'm thinking, and he pocket dialed, so hung the phone up. Don't worry about it, right? Well, a little bit later, a call came in again from him. It was the same thing, and this began to happen pretty consistently. I was getting calls from his phone, and ignoring it at first just because I was so busy, so much stuff going on. And then one day, I had gotten up out of my office, left my cell phone on my desk, come walking back in a little bit later. There's a missed call, and it was from him again. But there's a message on there, and I listened to the message, and it's this long message. But there's only background noise, and there's a kid laughing on the message. So, hindsight, I wish I had saved the message, of course, which you'll learn as we get further along. But, my first thought, the logical conclusion, right, I thought, he has a child. He has a young child. I'm thinking, his kid's got his phone, playing with his phone. So I shot him a message online, and I said, hey, man, look, your kid's getting your phone and keeps dialing my number. And he's very apologetic. He said, oh, yeah, that'll happen. I'm really sorry. It won't happen again. But it does. Well, now the calls start showing up at, like 3:30 in the morning, all these bizarre times. And person who I was actually working on another book. I was working on Strange Intruders at the time, and I would get, just kind of in a writing flow, and sometimes I would stay up all night and write. But these calls would come in. I would step away from my desk to get a cup of coffee or something, and when I came back, a call had come in. It was almost as if something knew when to call, that it wouldn't catch, that I wouldn't be there, that it would just be able to show up in this log on the phone or something. So, I had shot him another message in the midst of all this, and he apologizes again, and at that point he's like, my kid's not getting my phone, it can't, I don't think this is, I don't know what's going on. So then I'm sitting one night working again, and a message pops up from him, and it's basically, oh my God, I've got to talk to you. And it's really him, obviously, this time. And I talked to him, and he's like, you won't believe, he's so worked up. He's like, you're not going to believe this. So he said that he was laying with his cell phone beside him in the middle of the bed. He was reading Black-Eyed Children. And he said as he's sitting there reading the book, out of the corner of his eye, he saw his phone light up. And it was dialing my number.
Wow.
And he said he put the book down, he just looked at it, and he said he just watched it dial, And, of course, I had gotten this log from him, and I was sitting there thinking, and I was actually sitting by the phone when it happened, and I'm thinking, here we go again, And then the message pops up, it's really him. So he's like, okay, I'm taking this phone, to the cell phone store tomorrow, we got to figure out what's wrong with it. So he takes it in, they look it over, they can't find anything wrong with the phone. This whole thing continues to happen. But here's the kicker, Adam.
Uh-huh.
He goes on a road trip to some various locations on the East Coast. He's got his cell phone sitting on the dashboard of his car. It lights up and dials my number for the final time the moment he crosses over the bridge to Point Pleasant, West Virginia.
Oh, really? And, of course, we know for everybody who doesn't know, Point Pleasant, Virginia is what? Mothman, isn't it?
Exactly. So, home of the Mothman. It's the area where, of course, John Keel wrote the Mothman Prophecies book based on all the events, all the weirdness that happened there. And, of course, that brings it full circle to Keel and his whole idea of this greater, consciousness of something directing things. And it was the weirdest experience because when that happened, and he told me, I knew, I had this sense that there wouldn't be any more calls for now, and there weren't any more calls after that. And I also, it felt to me like something was saying, see, we can do what we want to. I really just had this weird sense that there was something that had a greater level of knowledge and awareness and could, if it chose to, manipulate things how it wanted them to be.
So what does it want, this consciousness? What do you think it wants, David? You must have thought about it. You're a bright guy. I know you have. What does it want?
In that case, you mean in that case in particular or in general?
General.
Wow, that's a big question. And, I think that we could sit here and talk about that all evening because I don't know. I'm not going to assume that I know what it wants, except for the fact that, I think that maybe to a degree in some of these cases it's revealing itself. It's intriguing to think about this concept in conjunction with this recent idea that people have that we're all living in a matrix, or that there's much more to the nature of our universe than, simple, sticks and stones. And we really, this may be leading us to a stage where we start to question the nature of our very reality in order to be able to make a greater step forward as humanity.
Is it helping us in some way, or is it malevolent, do you think?
I think that I'm not inclined to say that it's malevolent, no. I think that sometimes the manifestations are questionable, but I have to wonder, too, how much of our
co-creation takes a hand in that, because, I think that as a species we know so very little about the nature of our own potential and our own energy field. And, I think there are certain levels of these things that we co-create.
So do we choose to manifest them? Are people unconsciously manifesting them, or are they?
I think most of it's unconscious.
So they're
I
unconscious.
think most of it's unconscious.
Yeah, on some level.
Yeah.
We could carry on and on and on about this, but I'm conscious we're nearly out of time. We're nearly out of time. So we cannot. But I'm going to see you next week, am I not, at the Southeast Texas Bigfoot Conference?
Yeah, we're both speaking there. That's right.
Yeah, we're both speaking there, so we'll be able to hang out, and we can pursue this a little bit more over a drink of alcohol of some description. I'm sure that famous Texas.
That's right.
Very cool, very cool. Well, just tell us again when your next book is out and how we can get it and everything else, please, David.
Sure, that was Copper State Monsters, the Cryptids and Legends of Arizona that we spoke about briefly at the beginning, and that will be on Amazon certainly by the end of the month, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And the previous one, the Silver State Monsters, as well as all of my other books, including Black Eyed Children, are available at Amazon.com. Just Google my name, and you can go right to the author page and find all of those titles.
Yeah, and David, ladies and gentlemen, in case you don't know him, and I'm sure most of you do, he's a very good author, and he does. And you heard from his research tonight. He thoroughly researched his eyewitnesses, and he makes, I think, very, very useful conclusions about evidence. It was a great show, David. Thanks once again for joining us. Again, Mike and I are very grateful for you coming on tonight, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Mike. It's great talking to you guys. See you soon.
See you soon, David. And ladies and gentlemen, that was David Weatherly. That was fascinating stuff. I'm sure you agree with me. We'll be back soon, Mike and I. Have a great evening. Thank you very much, and good night.